was at this point that I had my fingers crossed, hoping for success.
So if you've been following me, then you will know that it wasn't a success. And if you haven't been following me, well, now's the time to start. So what we've seen there was the bike being started at the end of my last video, and unfortunately after changing the HT leads, the coil and the spark plugs, it didn't solve it. So we're on to the next thing. We're on to the crankshaft position sensor, or the ignition pickup sensor, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to crack open the alternator cover. We're going to pull off the old sensor, and we're going to try and prove that that is the source of the problem. So let's get to it.
So I've removed the bolts for the alternator cover, and I'm just catching the oil that's draining out. Now I've read online that with the bike on the side stand, only a small amount of oil comes out, but my oil level's sitting pretty much on the top mark, so we'll see. Just going to give the alternator cover a few wee love taps just to try and release it before pulling it off the gasket. Note I'm using a rubber mallet here, and there is a few wee sort of raised points on the cover for this. With a bit of a tug to break the magnetism, the alternator cover just pulls off. There's a bit more oil leaking out here, so I've got the tray underneath it, and the alternator cover sits quite nicely on top of the rear brake lever. I'd class this as more than just a little bit of oil leaking out. By Scottish measurements, it's a little bit more than half a bottle of iron brew. Using a 10mm Allen key, I'm just going to rotate the crankshaft so that one of the little sticky out bits on the rotor lines up underneath the sensor. There's 3 of these little knobbly bits on the rotor, and these are the triggers that pass underneath the position switch and activate it. So you can see here that I've now got one of them lined up perfectly underneath the bottom of the switch, and that gap between the two is measuring to be 1mm. Now the switch is held on by 2 Torx bolts, which when removed they look like they've been held in with some sort of Loctite or similar. So with the switch removed and hanging loose, I can then follow the cable up past the chain, up through the centre of the bike, and then up to where the front of the seat would be, and that's where the connector is. Since I've got the sensor off, I decided to test it, and it's reading 614 ohms, which is similar to what it states for a new one. So I decided to take the iron brew bottle full of oil, fill up a little pan, stick it on top of my camping stove, submerge the sensor, stick in my meat thermometer from my kitchen, don't show this to my wife, and as we can see here, it's a nice 23.4 degrees centigrade. So now I'm going to stick the gas on, and we're going to start heating the oil up. And the idea of this test is to prove that when the oil is getting hot and the sensor is heating up, that it fails. So the temperature's now rising, we're at 68.3 there, sorry it's upside down, and we've got a slight increase in resistance there, but it's still 640 odd ohms. 79 degrees, 80 degrees, and it's starting to climb, and it's just gone off the scale, so that's now open circuit on the sensor. The gas is off and it's slowly starting to cool down, and I'm just keeping an eye on it, and then, oh there we go, there it's starting to drop. Drops quite significantly and quite quickly. I've just repeated the same test, and I've got the sensor now sitting in fresh air, because the readings are still showing full open circuit even though the sensor's now cold, so it's not giving the same results every time. So it's a few days later, and the new parts that I ordered have just arrived in the post. We're going to pull this out and have a look. So inside we have replacement sensor. Now this is the replacement for the one that I took off, so if we have a look at these side by side. So this is part T1290131, and it's the sensor for the ignition. And if we have a look at the actual part itself, so this is the new one here, and this is the one that I took off. So it should be an identical part replacement. And I also have the alternator cover gasket, so this is part T12606968. Look inside here. So that should be the correct gasket for the alternator cover. Now before I go putting the new sensor onto
the bike. I'm just going to get my multimeter and I'm going to measure the resistance of the new sensor compared to the old. So if we just point the camera down a little bit and we check. First, I've got the old sensor that we removed the other day. I'll just check here. Now the other day when we were testing this, I was getting 600 and something ohms, and then it was failing to an open circuit when it was heated up. Now at the moment, with it cold, it's still showing open circuit, so for whatever reason, since we last tested it, it now seems to be a permanent open circuit regardless of whether it's hot or cold. And if I compare that with the new sensor that we've just had delivered, we have 595 ohms, so that's the correct reading for a new sensor. I purchased these parts from a company called Street Bike based in the West Midlands in England. The gasket cost me a total of £4.12 and the ignition sensor was £55.97. So all in all, with delivery, it came to £79.59.
Now I made the mistake of putting the bike on the centre stand here when I was going to open the alternator cover back up. So I've got oil leaking out again, but as I'm going to do an oil change anyway, I've decided to just let it continue draining.
Now you may remember when I removed the old sensor that one of the sides of it shows evidence of deformation, which suggests that it was over tightened when it was put on. Now if we have a look in my trusty Haynes manual here, we can see that the pickup coil sensor screws should be 10 Newton meters. So the torque is quite low, and they're only small 6mm bolts that take an internal T30 Torx drive. So make sure you've got the correct tool for applying the correct torque. And as it was seen when I removed the bolts, that Triumph have obviously used some sort of thread locker. So when I put them back on, I'll be using some medium strength Loctite. Now when I was removing the sensor, I damaged the gasket here for the alternator cover. So before I go putting a new one in, I'm going to remove the rest of this gasket, make sure the surface is clean so that it's ready for the new gasket to be applied. Now it goes without saying that the surface the gasket's going to sit on needs to be clean, otherwise you're going to end up with leaks because it won't seal. But also it's imperative that anything that you scrape off, you get cleaned out, because anything that's left inside this alternator end casing will end up being drawn into the oil. So you got to make sure that anything that you've scraped off, you clean up. You make sure that everything inside here is spotless.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Did you know that the pickup sensor was a problem, especially on the 06 and 07 engines that were fitted to the Bonneville, the T100, the America, the Thruxton and the Scrambler? So much so that Triumph investigated the numerous failures, and as a result they ended up changing the air gap between the rotor and the sensor. The service manuals originally stated 1mm plus or minus 0.2, and if we remember, the air gap that I measured on the sensor before I took it off was 1mm. I decided to have a hunt around online to see if I could find out any more information on this, and I found a post on one of the forums which had an extract from a Triumph statement which reads as follows. Now this states that the air gap was changed by a Triumph to 0.8mm. If I have a look in my Haynes manual, it states that the air gap should be 0.8 to 0.9, as we can see here. So I'm just going to set it to 0.8.
So on with fitting the new sensor. So I've got my feeler gauges here. You can see I'm using the 0.8mm. Now it's important that you have the engine turned correctly so that these little nodules that are on the alternator rotor that stick out a little bit, if you can see that. And in the Haynes manual they're actually referred to as triggers. I have seen them referred to by a number of names. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of Loctite to each one of the bolts, and then we'll get the sensor loosely into position. Then using our 0.8mm feeler gauge to set the right gap, we can then tighten up our screws, and finally we torque them up to the correct torque setting. Hopefully this stays in focus, but you can see that's 0.8mm feeler gauge there. It's a 0.88 which won't go, so set to 0.8, quite happy with that. Now if we have a look at when I was taking the old sensor off, we can see the run of the cable, how it goes here. So I'm just going to fix that in place and then we can get the gasket and the cover on. And of course it's important to get the grommet in place where it seals against the casing. And last but not least, get the gasket on in place. Now there is a couple of small double locating pins, one top, one bottom, that you should be able to use to hold the gasket loosely in place before putting the cover on. Now as I mentioned before, just make sure everything is completely clean, and when we're going to put the cover on, the magnetic force will snap it into place. So a quick look around at the gasket before putting the bolts in. Now I'm just loosely tightening these up with a 1/4 inch ratchet just to get all the bolts into place, and then we'll torque them up as per the spec in the Haynes manual. I'm just giving everything a good wipe, get all the oil, drips and everything away before I go any further. Okay, so all clean now around the cover, so if we do have any leaks, they should be easy to spot. So all that's left to do now is run the cable back through the way it came out. So I've got this little clamp here, it needs to go in, and it runs round through the back of the block, up underneath, and then goes into the connector under the seat. Okay, so it's routed almost the same way as the original. It's a little bit difficult getting up through some of the patches, so I've gone a little bit of a slightly different route, but once it's all cable tied down, it'll be fine. So I've got the end of the new sensor here, and you can just see the connector that goes into under the seat there. Now, just for my own peace of mind, before I go connecting that up, I'm just measuring resistance for the new sensor again, so 589, so that's fine, happy with that. I've had the alternator cover removed because I was doing the pickup sensor, which resulted in me draining a little bit of oil, and I was planning to do an oil change anyway, so before I go putting some new oil in, top this up before I can test the ignition system, I'm just going to carry on with the oil change. Okay, so that's the oil filter changed. I've changed the air filter as well. It's filled up with oil to the correct level. So now I'm going to start it up and we'll see if we can get it to run longer than it did before I changed the pickup sensor. Hopefully it'll just continue to idle. Now what I want to do is measure the temperature of the engine casing here where the oil sat, to see if it's getting above the 80-85 degrees, which is where we saw the failure of the sensor when I was testing it in my little camp stove. Right, so she's ran for quite some time at idle. I wasn't actually timing it, I was more interested in monitoring the temperature, as you can see there. So I got up to like 87 degrees there at the oil cooler, which is well at the temperature where I saw the failure of the ignition pickup when we tested it previously. So I'm quite happy. The only real test really we've got to do now is get the seat back on it and get out on the road.
there we have it. Bonneville T100 is fixed. Problem was the ignition pickup sensor. If you like this video, please hit the like button, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you all on the next one.